Y'all get strapped in because this is gonna be an interesting one. So I promised you guys about a year ago for more Gilmore Girls commentary, and I needed the time to get through the show and properly articulate my thoughts. So the one thing I wanted to talk about actually was Lane Kim and her mother, Mrs. Kim, and the paradox that is overbearing parenting. As much as I do like Mrs. Kim towards the end of the show, I really do feel that Mrs. Kim's type of parenting is a clear warning, and it shows us the direct effects of having an overbearing or a toxic parent. I've seen a lot of discourse about Mrs. Kim as a person, and normally I do like to give parenting in characters grace because we don't necessarily know that much about them, or there's so many nuances to their characters. And I'll try to do the same to Mrs. Kim, but at the same time, I cannot help but recognize how Lane could have had more if she had had more supportive parents. But first, if you guys don't know who I am, hi, my name is Deborah, student, singer, songwriter, and anything else in between. Welcome back to my channel where I talk about my favorite TV shows, movies, and books, and today we're talking about Lane Kim and the paradox that is strict, toxic, and overbearing parenting. So let's get strapped in. First of all, I want to talk about these two women as separate people, right? So let's start with Lane Kim. Lane Kim, I think that her personality doesn't get as much shine throughout the show, but let's look at her for who she is. She's an intelligent girl. She has been forced to grow up in this extremely strict household, and still with that, she still remains herself. She does the best she can. She also managed to be a cheerleader. She is a musician and clearly a pop culture fanatic. She's sweet, very organized, and she's hardworking. And if it wasn't for her strict parenting or her household, I really feel like her earlier childhood self could have had a bigger opportunity to flourish because she had so much depth to her character. I think a lot of her energy, unfortunately, that is supposed to have been spent on her childhood and growing into womanhood was spent actually trying to survive her childhood with her mother. You can see this by the normal experiences that every young girl is supposed to have is shrouded in secrecy. But at the same time, I also do recognize the positives of that. I mean, imagine the levels of coordination one must have to have a fake boyfriend, to disguise her real boyfriend, and then also be able to sneak off to New York. And not a lot of people will be able to do that. She's also able, despite an oppressive childhood, to sneak off and practice for her music career. She's an amazing drummer. And as somebody who grew up in a similar household and is still interested and does make music till this day, that's true perseverance. Lane is a person who can persevere, and I feel like that doesn't get recognized enough. She is very driven and ambitious. Lane Kim is quite smart, and she's been able to do with what she can and what she's been given. When she moves out, she's not lazy. She does everything she can. She works despite the economy, and she prides herself on being independent, which I really love for her. Now we can look at Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim, as much as I don't like how she's raised her daughter, is also quite an interesting person. She's definitely a traditional Korean woman. She's an immigrant who migrated from Korea to the US, and coming from an immigrant family myself, this archetype is actually quite common in a lot of mothers and aunties from her generation. She is a very hardworking woman who had to settle in the US in 1984 and try and grow her own business, which she owns, by the way, which I feel like also doesn't get mentioned a lot, how she owns her own business, but that's pretty cool. Being able to sell antiques and make a living off of that is quite insane. She's been able to do that, and alongside her husband, who is alive, by the way, is able to send Lane to school, and that deserves a lot of recognition on its own. I do recognize that it's definitely not easy raising a child, especially when you come from a completely different culture and you speak a completely different language, especially in the US. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure she's faced some sort of discrimination and racism, especially in the years of 1984 until the 2000s. And that can be quite jarring for someone. It's a very big sacrifice to leave one's homeland and come to the US or anywhere else in the West and try to do as much as they possibly can for their own children. You can hear Mrs. Kim say this herself. She sees parenting and marriage as a job.
Marriage is a job, Lane. There are rewards that come with this job, but there are also sacrifices. There are things you're going to have to do.
So to her, this was her duty. This was what she was supposed to do. This was her job, which is actually a little bit sad, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So there is more to Mrs. Kim than meets the eye. But I also will say that we don't really get to see Mrs. Kim's growth until Lane is bold enough to move out of her family home. It is with this assertion and independence and change do we finally see the better parts of Mrs. Kim's personality, and we finally start to see her lighten up and recognize that Kim is going to start making her own decisions. But if Lane didn't take her life into her own hands and move out, I can assure you we wouldn't have seen Mrs. Kim's personal growth or eventual growth that quickly. But that leads me to my first talking point. Number one, Mrs. Kim is extremely controlling to the point where it's actually aggravating. It's no secret that Lane's mother is extremely controlling. And while I can't really speak for Korean mothers because I myself am not Korean, I can speak as an African child with this sort of archetype within her family as well. This archetype of mother is also common in African households or in fathers as well. I mean, this woman literally controls what they eat, where they go, how many times she sees people during the day, how many times she can use the phone, where she can go, what she can wear. It's actually really unbearable and it's personally insane, and I can't negate that. And as much as people try and defend Mrs. Kim, I really think this was completely outrageous how much to every single detail Lane's life had to be controlled. She not only imposes crazy, ridiculous dating rules, but she also expects Lane to be this traditional Korean girl that does everything that she's supposed to do correctly and remains a good Christian girl and finds a good husband. That is the most of her expectation. And unfortunately, with how things work in the US and the economy and how expensive college education is, Lane doesn't really have a choice for the majority of her life. Another aspect to Mrs. Kim's control is also with Lane's father. I think it's quite interesting that we don't see Mr. Kim. At some point, I actually wondered if he was alive. He is very well alive, but you just don't see him come downstairs, which is so interesting. The fact that he literally stays indoors and doesn't help out his own wife at the antique store, nor help out his daughter, nor do we see them eat together or anything, which is so off. But it seems also that Mr. Kim doesn't really participate in raising his own daughter. And as far as we can see, it's Mrs. Kim that's imposing all of the rules, which I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if it's Mrs. Kim who's imposing such rules to the point where he doesn't really have a say in the family and he just decided to take a backseat role and just become an enabler and just let whatever happens, or if there's something wrong with Mr. Kim, or he's not emotionally available in his marriage and in his life and in his children either. Why do we not see him outside? There's so many questions I have about Mr. Kim. But the most important thing I wanted to point out here is that if it's a situation where Mrs. Kim is the one who just imposes all the house rules, then this definitely fits a certain dynamic that you also see in real life, where you have a controlling parent and you have an enabler parent who goes along with whatever the controlling parent says. And a lot of the times the enabler parent, while they seem to be the more relaxed one, is inherently also making a very selfish decision by taking the backseat, because they're not necessarily putting their children first. They're just taking the backseat in order to keep peace in their relationship for themselves. But at the same time, by keeping the peace in your personal relationship for yourselves and your own marriage, you're not considering how this is affecting the child. By you as a parent stepping in, you can always add relief to your own child's life. But the fact that Mr. Kim doesn't really do that is also quite concerning, and we don't really see him is crazy. But that also speaks to Mrs. Kim's control, especially in the early seasons. Now, I do recognize that she does become much more better with this later on, but it is quite concerning how this family dynamic works. I also understand that things can be exaggerated on television. However, at the same time, I also know families who are like this in real life, and they have this extreme sort of amount of control in their child's life. So sometimes this isn't really far-fetched. But yeah, I wonder a lot of the times if it's Mrs. Kim actively making sure that Mr. Kim cannot participate as much, or if Mr. Kim is clearly checked out and Mrs. Kim is just the one who's left to raise her child, essentially making her a married single parent, which is also concerning. But I'm always looking for an explanation as to how this works. If it's a situation where Mr. Kim does not actually want to be involved in the child raising part, then that would explain why Mrs. Kim is also so uptight all the time, because she's constantly having to do everything by herself. I mean, she works in this antique shop and she's definitely bringing home money, but we don't see Mr. Kim, so we don't know if he's actively participating as well, or he has his own business or something like that to help them financially. But you can imagine that is quite stressful on a mother, having to do everything by herself and also having to regulate her own child's life. So that can also explain her uptightness a lot of the times, especially in the early few seasons. But if her husband did want to participate and she's just a tyrant ruler, well, that's another situation. Anyways, let's move on. Why does Mrs. Kim do this? First of all, we can look at Mrs. Kim's childhood. It's very evident to see where Mrs. Kim sort of got her outlook and attitude on life when we look at her own mother. When her own mother comes to visit for Lane's wedding, Mrs. Kim can't even be her full self despite being an adult grown woman with a child and a husband and a home of her own in a different continent. She still has to hide her own identity from her own mother, and also down to her own personal faith and religion. As a woman who's probably in her 40s as of the early seasons, probably going to her 50s, Mrs. Kim herself is not free from the wanting of approval from her own mother, so much so that it disrupts her own daughter's wedding. So when when we look at Mrs. Kim's mother and the fact that she has also lived in a society that is very collective, and a society probably in her time that had a lot of expectations for women in general and how they should be, we can see why she is the way she is. Her mother was also strict and overbearing and disapproves of literally everything that Mrs. Kim does. So we can understand why she acts this way towards Lane, because this is also what she has grown up with as her own person. And I'm pretty sure this is the only way she knew how to raise her own child. But at the same time, the problem is that Mrs. Kim, especially in the earlier seasons, is not a very open person. She does eventually open up, but that's because her child had to move away to another household. Without this extreme measure, Mrs. Kim would not have been as open. And she's not an open person when it comes to American values either. She wants to stick to her own traditional values, and she sees adopting American values, especially in the earlier season, as a problem. It's this weird, misguided idea that some parents do have, that if they stick to their traditional values from their own culture, that the child will never become too westernized. I've definitely heard this phenomenon before, as they believe that westernized kids do not have morals and values that are up to par as their own, which is a very shallow way to look at other people and a culture as a whole. I'm a firm believer that we can always learn things from one another in our own cultures. Surely you do not have to adapt everything that is American, but you can definitely learn a few things from one another. I also do think that Mrs. Kim thinks that by sticking to this traditional values, she can raise a child that's also approved by her mother, and the rest of their Korean community, because she herself centers herself around the Korean community that's in the US. And I can imagine what a lot of mothers like her say is that they don't want to raise a child that is a disappointment or a great shame or brings shame to the family name. So of course, what does this community accept? It accepts women who act like Mrs. Kim, who have strict Korean traditional values and follow the rules, and that's it. There's no space for more. So naturally, it makes sense why she would want to raise Kim that way. Does it make sense in how she does that? No. Does it make sense to expect that from a child who's literally not lived in Korea and lived in a completely different country? Also no. But it's an attempt to understand Mrs. Kim's psyche. I also want to add to that by saying that Mrs. Kim, by surrounding herself with only people that are from her culture and are also like her, she doesn't really fraternize with American people in an effort to conserve her traditional values and culture, is also a detriment to herself sometimes. It would have helped to have some friends that are really open her eyes to see how much she's damaging her own child and their own mother-daughter relationship. Because as far as I know, and you've seen in the show, she only really hangs out with her own people or people from the Seventh-day Adventist church, which seems to be a lot of Korean people, and that's not a problem. The thing is that when you isolate yourself from the rest of society, you tend to only see yourself in the same similar frame of reference, and that can be a detriment to you as a person because that can leave you stagnant. Mrs. Kim a lot of the time wants to stay the same. She wants things that are very familiar to her, and I think as a result she's also afraid of change because she deems change as a negative thing or as something that is scary. And you see this when she finally decides to visit Lane after a while. She gets completely overwhelmed and she runs away after seeing her daughter be surrounded by boys, which in itself is not a bad thing in another frame of reference. But because she is so stuck in her own traditional values and ways, it becomes so overwhelming when there is a change that she has to run out because she doesn't know how to deal with it. Instead of her to sit down and take the time to process that her daughter living outside with these boys who actually recognize her and are actually very respectful is not a harm to Lane. But you can see that with Mrs. Kim, this is a complete foreign thought to her, which shows you just how long she has been ingrained in this idea of how to live. I also think this is a detriment to Mrs. Kim herself. She is so stagnant in her own little community that also sees women as only mothers and wives that she herself as a woman doesn't have an opportunity to do things for herself. I do notice how her whole entire life revolves around selling her antiques, being a mom, and being a wife, and she sees it like a job. She sees marriage like a job. But if she had had other friends, perhaps from different cultures, she could also take some time to herself and also enjoy herself and her womanhood as she's growing older. It would have been great to see her have another friend that was perhaps from a different culture so that she herself as a woman could discuss her own relationship issues. Because who is she going to discuss it with? The other women who are also stuck in relationships like hers? It's also a detriment to her own personal growth as a woman, not just as a mother and a wife. And what she doesn't realize is that by forming other friendly relationships with other women her age, she can have active hobbies that she enjoys outside of raising Lane, which would give Lane the opportunity to also be by herself more and see how it is to grow as a woman into adulthood. It's one of the reasons that a lot of older women love shows like Golden Girls, and we love Sex and the City. Seeing older women be more outside of these rigorous roles of being a mother and a wife is so refreshing. And I feel like by Mrs. Kim sort of stunting herself and stunting her own growth, it affects her life on a personal, deeper level. Now, I will give her some credit. She, like I said, is willing to change and grow and adapt, and even creates a tour for Lane's band. But like I said previously, this change does not happen until Lane takes control of her own life. Therefore, she is forced to now see her daughter as her own human being. But this progression should naturally happen without Lane having to take such a drastic measure. But unfortunately, it doesn't. One extra point that I wanted to add here before I talk about how this impacts Lane herself is this unrealistic expectation when it comes to traditional values. This is actually a problem that I can relate to in real life with a lot of immigrant parents who come from very strict traditional societies, especially societies that are very collectively based and focus on the collective identity rather than the individual identity. This basically means that in societies that have a collective identity, your identity is not focused on you as an individual, but rather focused on what role you fit in that society. So when you have a very collective identity, you are not your individual self, but you are a wife of somebody or a mother of somebody or the woman who works at church, rather than you as an individual and what your assets are as a human being. Versus in individual societies, you are more focused on the individual identity, who you are, what your interests are, and how you see yourself. And that also means you will have the opportunity to create your own individual identity. In collective societies, a lot of the times, having an individual identity tends to be a threat to the status quo. If you live in a collective society where the women are expected to be traditional and have traditional values, you being a single woman who doesn't want to get married or doesn't want to have kids seems to be either a threat or a problem or abnormality in the status quo. Versus in individual societies, that is deemed as perfectly normal. At the same time, a lot of individualistic societies focus more on themselves to the point where there seems to be a lack of community. So each one has their pros and cons. And the problem is with immigrant parents that have very strict traditional values that are very community based is that when they moved to another country, they do not adapt with how the country is. And this is not to say that one must lose their own traditional values, but rather understand the kind of environment that they're in. They expect their own children to follow suit. What happens is that you have a child that is very integrated into both societies. So they have one foot in and one foot out. They'll have one foot into the Western society, but they'll also have one foot into their own traditional culture as well, which is what happens to Lane. She is a Korean American, so she is Korean in her identity and in her race, but she also has American values. She is interested in American pop culture. She's aware of it. She's had to learn that all of her life alongside her Korean culture, and has gone to an American school all of her life. So there would definitely be a split of interests. This will conflict with what Mrs. Kim and a lot of immigrant parents have as their traditional expectation for their child to grow into. And that's the unrealistic expectation. If you have a child that has not grown up in the same society you did when you were younger, it is completely unrealistic to expect that that child would adhere to the same rules that you had to when you were his or her age. That's what happens with Lane and her mother. You can see there's a clear conflict where Lane has now had some American values and wants to be a little bit more individualistic and form her own individual identity while still having Korean values. And yet this comes in complete conflict with Mrs. Kim, who wants to only have strict traditional Korean values. So it's completely unrealistic to expect your child to follow and adhere to the same rules if they're not even surrounded with people who look like them. This is also a deeper conversation that goes into a lot of dysmorphia with immigrant children, because from a young age, our parents had people who looked like them when they were younger. So as a result, the issue of representation is not as a big deal to them as it is when you're an immigrant child. Because as you're growing, you see people that don't look like you. And especially because you grow up in a lot of societies with racism and discrimination, a lot of the times these children end up with issues when it comes to identity and how they look or how they are as people. That is when the parent is supposed to step in and definitely reinforce the child's identity. But a lot of times, because immigrant parents have never had to deal with that, they don't know how to effectively help their children in such a unique situation. And I think that definitely happens with Lane a lot of the time. But luckily, as Lane becomes more independent and as Mrs. Kim changes, she's more open to Lane's ideas. It does take a lot of time and growth, but but he finally accepts it. What would have worked better for Lane is that instead of forcing her to go to 7 Days Adventist, what she could have done instead is to educate her about the aspects of their culture, what they traditionally believe, while giving Lane the room to understand and see what she wants and what she desires, so that they can find a good compromise in between. One moment that I see this sort of blending happen is when Lane brings over her boyfriend Zach and the rest of the band to her family home. And they start playing instruments that are traditionally Korean. You also hear Zach talk about using other instruments to play besides the electric guitar. It is this hybrid mixing of cultures that can actually really work in Mrs. Kim's and Lane's favor. Instead of not allowing Lane to play music or listen to music, she could have supported Lane in learning traditional instruments, especially that are very known in Korean culture, and also supported her using those same instruments when she plays like drums or she plays in a traditional rock band, therefore creating a fusion of creativity in their household. Simple things like this.
Do you know how iconic and groundbreaking it would be to have a Korean American artist be in a rock band who also played Korean instruments and fused that within rock music? That would have been insane.
But instead, she didn't do that. Now, the final question is, how does this impact Lane? I feel like Lane's childhood impacts her in so many ways that are really unspoken. I'm not a psychologist, so I cannot get too deep into it, but I definitely see how when Lane looks back at her childhood, it's going to be a lot of trauma that she's looking back into, and there was an unnecessary amount of walking on eggshells and anxiety and trauma that Lane is going to have to unpack as an adult, because her childhood was never really normal. Now, normal is relative to everybody, so I don't really like saying that, but her childhood was never balanced. There was not enough emotional regulation
and space to recognize and validate one's feelings, which could bleed into other parts of her relationships.
I do sometimes think, and this is my own personal opinion, as much as I do like her and Zach sometimes, I wish Kim would have been able to spread her wings a little bit more and dated around, or at least had an opportunity to have a career before she got married. Because she got married at the young age of 21, and then having a child right away, that can really affect your life trajectory. And while I do not think this is a negative thing, I do feel that Lane should have had the opportunity to find herself as a person outside of her strict parents' household and outside of Stars Hollow. She is such a smart young woman, and I wanted her to have the opportunity to travel and be a young single woman and find who she is as a person before settling down. I also think that if her mother and her parents had been more supportive of or understanding of their child's wants and needs and wanted her to be her own independent person, she could have achieved way more and done a lot more. I think that if they had supported her young career as a musician, Lane could have had an opportunity to perhaps meet another band. Of course, this is not a guarantee, but I do feel that sometimes she could have achieved way more if she had more supportive parents. But anyways, that's just my personal opinion. You guys let me know down in the comments below how you're personally feeling. I think this relationship between mother and daughter shows us the clear effects of having an overbearing parent, and luckily for Lane, her mother does become more open, but unfortunately a lot of people in real life don't really have that opportunity. So I do love that Mrs. Kim eventually does become better, but I also see how this has affected a lot of Lane's life as a person. But I don't know, you guys tell me how you're feeling down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I have been working on this one for a while, and my apologies for such a late video. I have also been working in real life, so it's been kind of hard to find a balance, but I will be coming with more videos soon, so stay tuned. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Okay, bye.
Oh my